Hello guys and welcome back. If you are new around here, I cover mostly Australian cases and today we are covering another solved case. And this case, well, there are no words to describe it. I will be putting warnings and timestamps throughout this video, but to give you an idea, some of the details of this case were so awful that they were court ordered to be sealed forever and never be released to the public. And this was also a case that rocked Australia so much that the public were crying out for the return of the death penalty. Also, brace yourselves to be absolutely fuming by the end of this video because, as you are about to see, the justice system well and truly failed this family. And I believe it's cases like this that we need to keep talking about and keep in the public eye as long as things aren't changing. And you may have noticed my new addition here, and that is because of you guys giving me feedback in my community tab a couple of weeks ago about my sound. You were also very helpful. I know a lot of you listen to this channel like a podcast, which I think is great. I don't mind if you guys don't want to watch my mug for 30 minutes, but hopefully this mic will make these videos a little bit better quality. But having said all of that, let's get straight into today's case. So we're heading all the way back to the year of 1993 to a small historical settlement called Greenough, which is 400 k's or 248 odd miles north of where I live right here in Perth, Western Australia. Or if you are local to WA, that is pretty much right next to Geraldton. Oh, and by the way, when I do say WA, Western Australia, I feel like outside of Australia that may not be as obvious as I think. So in Greenough lived single mother Karen MacKenzie, who was 31 years old, and her three children, 16-year-old Daniel, 7-year-old Amara, and 5-year-old Katrina, as well as their pet dog, who sadly I could not find out the name of. Karen was described as happy, bubbly, outgoing, and kind, and the kind of person that would give you the shirt off her back. And she was also a lover of the great outdoors. Since she was a child, she had an interest in plants, nature, and in general just being outside and soaking up the beauty around her. However, despite her positive demeanour, Karen's upbringing had not been an easy one. Karen and her sister Evelyn had both been the victims of sexual abuse, trauma that would continue to haunt Karen well into her adulthood. Evelyn and Karen at least did have each other though, and as Evelyn described it, she saw it as herself and Karen against the world. They also had two brothers and their mother Barbara, who unfortunately suffered with alcoholism during Karen's childhood. And as a result of her difficult childhood, by the time Karen reached her early teens, she began to rebel and soon fell into the wrong crowd. She dabbled in drugs, and by the age of 14, she had moved out on her own and was pregnant. Just after her 15th birthday, Karen gave birth to a baby boy who she named Daniel. And Karen tried her absolute hardest to raise Daniel over the next few years, but just before his second birthday, the overwhelming pressure of being a young single mother became too much. So she gave Daniel to her mother and moved across the country from where she lived in Queensland to Western Australia. Moving forward a few years, when Karen was in her early 20s, she met a man named Andrew Allen. They started dating and the relationship soon turned serious. The couple eventually went on to have two daughters together, Amara followed by Katrina. The girls were described as being very sweet little girls who absolutely adored their mother. At this time, Karen's first child, Daniel, was still living in Queensland, being raised by his grandmother. Unfortunately, as time passed, Karen and Andrew realised that they were not meant to be, and the couple separated. And Karen once again was a single mother, but this time she was older, wiser, and was a lot stronger. Karen actually owned her own home, a modest weatherboard home in Greenough that sat in a fairly isolated area. To get to it, you really had to know where it was. It was basically down a side road and then down a long driveway, hidden from street view, or at least that's how I understood it. And although at the time the house was in quite a bit of need of being renovated, Karen had big plans to really pull the place together and make it her own little family unit. In 1992, Karen's now 15-year-old son, Daniel, decided that he wanted to come and live with his mum and half-sisters in WA. Much to Karen's excitement, Daniel's life had been a bit of an unstable one in Queensland. He was described as a good kid, but a bit of a ratbag, and the change of scenery was going to be a positive one for not only him, but for Karen as well. He received a coach ticket for his birthday and was soon making his way across the country. And I'm guessing he got a coach to WA and not a plane, because in 1993 flights were bloody expensive. It's just a guess though, as I'm not sure you would catch a coach unless you wanted to take the really scenic route, considering the drive across the country is roughly 2 days. And that's if you're driving straight, as in 2 days straight, non-stop. Just to give you a perspective of how big Australia is. So to do that trip realistically would take about 4 to 5 days. But anyway, by late 1992, Daniel was living with his mother and enrolled in a local high school in Geraldton, which was a massive step for him, as he had actually decided to leave school when he was back in Queensland. To top it off, Daniel adored his 2 younger half-sisters. And as a bonus for Karen, Daniel could help her babysit the girls occasionally as well, giving her the chance to go out and let her hair down every once in a while. So December of 1992 would be the first Christmas that Karen would be spending with all 3 of her children. But sadly, it was also going to be their last. Despite how well things seemed to be going for Karen, she still did battle some personal demons. She suffered from depression and continued to struggle with the trauma of the sexual abuse that she experienced during her childhood. Also, as an adult, Karen did continue to dabble in drugs, but by no means was she a drug addict or even a regular user, from my understanding. She did, however, have a few friends at the time that ran in those crowds, drug takers, dealers, etc. So in early 1993, Karen was in a brief relationship, but broke it off with him on or around Valentine's Day by sending him a bunch of flowers that said goodbye in a card, which is kind of nice and kind of savage. Shortly after this breakup, Karen decided that she needed a night out to relax, let her hair down, all of that. So she asked Daniel if he could babysit the girls, and he agreed. It was February 19, a Friday, and Karen headed to a house party in nearby Geraldton. She stayed at the party until around 5 a.m. and after was dropped off safely back at her home by a friend at the party. Little did Karen's friends know at the party that this would be the last time they would see Karen alive again. So now we're skipping ahead 2 days to the morning of Monday, February 22, when 2 of Karen's good friends, a husband and a wife, whose names I could not find, were driving over to Karen's house to help her out with some home renovations. As they headed up the driveway and began to approach the home, they saw what appeared to be a body lying out the front. The couple stopped the car and the husband cautiously began to approach the body. He soon realizes that the motionless body is 16-year-old Daniel. He's covered in blood, almost unrecognizable. Shocked but now concerned for the safety of Karen and her 2 girls, the husband approaches the home and begins to call out Karen's name. He hears their dog barking through the back door, but doesn't receive any response from Karen or her girls. The wife, who is still sitting in the car, is beginning to feel more and more uneasy about this situation, as I think anybody would be by this point. And she frantically calls out for her husband to return to the car so they can go and get some help. The couple try some of Karen's neighbours first, but have no luck, so they drive to the Greenough Pottery Museum, which I'm guessing was the next closest place with a phone, and they call the police, remembering very few people in 1993 had mobile phones. Actually, I'm honestly not sure if anybody had mobile phones in 1993. And also, do people in America call mobile phones cell phones? Because when I was writing up this script and I was writing mobile phone, I realised that my US friends say cell phone, but you guys know what a mobile is, right? When I say it, let me know down below, because I always want to be aware of when there is a difference in our language, I guess. Anyway, they phoned the police and soon there were officers heading to Karen's home. And I will say, as a side note, I am so glad that the husband and or the wife did not attempt to enter Karen's home, because if they had, I'm not sure they would have been able to recover from what was waiting inside. So when the police arrived at the scene, the first thing that they saw, of course, was the body of Daniel. They quickly established that he was deceased. Detective Merv Cousins was the first to enter the home, and the first thing that he saw in the living room was Karen's naked, deceased body. Her top half was covered by a blanket, and her body was in a crouching, kneeling type position, and there was blood everywhere. And this was a result of Karen having been attacked, or should I say more accurately, having been hacked at with some kind of weapon. Next, police discovered the bodies of the two little girls, Katrina and Amara, in their bedrooms. All three children suffered similar injuries to their mother. The crime scene police were presented with was of such a disturbing nature, some officers vomited at the scene. Others left the force or transferred departments shortly after. And in this video, I am not going to be going into any extreme detail, of course, as the evidence I'll be talking about paints enough of a disturbing picture as to what happened, making it pretty easy for you to piece together. However, when I do discuss the murders in more detail, I will be including a timestamp there. And if you do look it up in your own time, just be aware about how sick, disturbed and depraved the details of this case are. I was so close to backing out of covering this case many times, believe me. But as I'll discuss later, if there is any chance that the monster that committed these crimes could be released from jail, I want as many people as possible to be aware of what occurred, so we have a chance at preventing that from ever happening. Anyway, the Geraldton police, who were the first at the crime scene, quickly contacted the Major Crime Squad back in Perth to assist them with the investigation. Crime Squad detectives soon arrived in Greenough, but quickly became concerned by weather conditions. As February is summer here in Australia, it was not only hot, but it was windy as well, and conditions like that are prime for ruining forensic evidence. So they had to work pretty quickly. As investigators analysed the scene, they wondered if Daniel had attempted to escape the house during the attack to go get help, but they would later discover that he had been the first victim. The first key piece of evidence that was discovered was a palm print in the home. So investigators took photos of the print, but as this was 1993 and the only cameras available to them were the film cameras, they couldn't risk that the images would be developed and not be usable. So they actually removed that part of the wall where the palm print was, so they could refer back to it later. Next, an ultraviolet polylight was used in and around the home, and what this did was show evidence that was not visible to the naked eye. This examination revealed some greasy marks on a door that they thought likely contained fingerprints, so they removed the entire door and sent that away for testing. The results from the door soon came back and it showed that the greasy marks were likely a sorbeline cream. And I'm honestly not sure if every other country has sorbeline, but basically it's like a super cheap, basic, standard, run-of-the-mill, affordable body lotion. I think that was way too descriptive. But anyway, at first investigators were pretty puzzled over these results, as there was no sorbeline cream found in Karen's home. And in fact, the greasy marks didn't match any of Karen's creams or any creams that investigators had in their database. However, the good news was that the greasy marks did contain fingerprints, sort of. It contained fingerprint tips, as in like the tips of someone's fingers had touched to the grease, meaning that every person that had been fingerprinted so far in the investigation had to be re-fingerprinted. As the forensic side of things were developing, a massive manhunt was in progress to find the person that committed such heinous crimes. And Greenough was such a small place, the locals were living in fear during this time that a monster lived amongst them. One of the first people investigators looked into was, of course, as is always the case with homicides like this, was the ex. That is Karen's ex-partner and father to her two girls, Andrew Allen. However, it was found that he was in Halls Creek, which is up north of WA at the time of the murders, and in fact had been trapped up there, so he had a watertight alibi and could be ruled out. They also looked into Karen's most recent boyfriend, who she had just broken up with around Valentine's Day. He had phoned Karen at about 11:15 p.m. on the night of the murders, and he had no real solid alibi as to where he was that night, making him a pretty solid person of interest. Not to mention he kind of had motive as well. Investigators would continue to speak to a few dozen persons of interest over the coming weeks and even had known drug users and dealers coming forward wanting to help the investigation because everybody was so disgusted with what had happened to Karen and her young children. Police did at first think that the crimes may have been related to drugs or even bikie gangs, as Karen did, as I said, dabble in drugs. So having cooperation from people in that world was incredibly helpful. A number of the men investigators spoke to also gave blood, saliva, hair and semen samples, as a sexual assault had also been part of the crimes. But back in 1993, semen samples could not actually be matched to an individual. They could only eliminate them. As I understand it, they could figure out an individual's blood type from the semen sample. So, for example, if the sample was an O positive and you're a B positive, you could be eliminated. But if you are an O positive, then you cannot be eliminated. It could still be your semen. I think you get the point. Police, of course, also spoke to all the guests at the party that Karen attended in Geraldton, including one in particular that caught the attention of investigators, and that was 22-year-old farmhand William Patrick Mitchell, often called Bill by friends. And Mitchell, who was an acquaintance of Karen's, was actually the one that dropped her off after the party. So a little bit about Mitchell just for context. He grew up with 5 brothers and sisters, and his parents often struggled to make ends meet. Because of this, Mitchell often got hand-me-downs, often clothing that was old and a bit tattered, making him the perfect target for schoolyard bullying. At age 11, his mother passed away, and as he entered his teen years, he fell in with a pretty rough crowd and got pretty involved in the drug scene. People that knew him described him as a loner with very few friends. And as an adult, Mitchell continued to take drugs, pretty heavily in fact, and had taken a fair amount on the day of the party. But anyway, Mitchell told police that after the party he drove the 25 k's or 15 miles to Karen's house to drop her off, and then he crashed for the night. And he left at around 11 a.m. the following day, which can be confirmed by Karen's neighbours. Mitchell and Karen were also seen in what looked like an argument at the party, although I couldn't find any information as to what this argument was about, and I'm not even sure if Mitchell ever told investigators what they were arguing about. However, Mitchell did admit that he did try to make a move on Karen that night, but she was not interested. And I can only guess that since Karen was a 31-year-old mother of 3, and Mitchell was what sounds like an immature 22-year-old, she just had no interest. But since Karen did accept a lift home from Mitchell, we can assume that this argument must have blown over. So due to the fact that Mitchell was one of the last people to see Karen alive, he of course became a person of interest. And because of this, one of the first things they did was compare the palm print found in Karen's home to Mitchell's palm print. And it was actually a match. But as I said, Mitchell did stay over at Karen's house after the party, so at some point he could have leaned against a wall with his palm, and that doesn't really prove anything in the end. It just proves that he was in the house at some point, like you said. On Friday, March the 5th, a funeral was held for Karen, Daniel, Amara and Katrina, and William Mitchell was in attendance. So not long after William Mitchell became a suspect, a pretty strange incident occurred. Police received a frantic phone call from the host of the party saying that their house had been broken into and there was blood everywhere. With a killer still on the loose, this was a terrifying situation. Police soon arrived at the scene where they found the car keys and wallet of William Mitchell. For a moment, police wondered if Mitchell had become a victim of this killer on the loose. But as police were analysing the crime scene and trying to figure out what had happened, the bathroom door bursts open and William Mitchell dramatically enters the room, screaming and crying in pain. He has a towel around his waist, which is absolutely soaked in blood. Mitchell tells police that he was visiting the home when out of nowhere 3 men attacked him and dragged him inside. He says that the 3 men told him that they knew that the party host was Karen's killer, Karen's family's killer, and threatened if he did not tell them where the party host was, he would be next. When Mitchell told them that he had no idea where they were, they grabbed a filleting knife and attempted to cut off his penis. He says he eventually fought off the 3 men and ran and locked himself in the bathroom until police arrived. Mitchell was of course immediately taken to Geraldton Hospital to deal with the unusual injuries. And this is when he told police that actually he made the whole thing up, and trying to cut off his own private area had actually been a suicide attempt. Now, I would never ever make light of someone taking their own life, but to take a filleting knife to your own, surely not. Surely not. Ugh. Following this, police charged him with making a false statement. Meanwhile, another strange incident that had a connection to William Mitchell was reported to the police from a caravan park owner in Geraldton. A caravan park cleaner found a caravan that was due to be cleaned, splattered with blood, semen, and pornographic magazines that had been slashed up with razor blades. The cleaner reported this unusual scene to the caravan park's owner, Bernie MacArthur, who says that the Greenough murders immediately came to his mind. So he reported it to the police, just in case. And wouldn't you know it, that the last person staying in this caravan was William Mitchell. However, police made the decision that they were going to keep this particular piece of information away from the press or media. So back to some of the forensic testing I mentioned earlier, just for a moment. As I said, fingertip prints were found in a greasy substance in Karen's home, and because it was fingertips, not fingerprints, they had to go back and fingerprint every suspect, and that included Mitchell. So Detective Bryn Jones paid Mitchell a visit at the farm that he worked at to ask him if he would be happy to come down and just have his fingerprints redone. But in response, Mitchell told Detective Jones that he was pretty surprised that the investigation was still going on, as he had heard in the media that the perpetrator had been caught acting strange in a caravan park in Geraldton. Detective Jones, who knew this information had not been reported to the media, realised that this was Mitchell practically and unknowingly confessing to being the killer. The fingerprint tip testing was quickly pushed ahead after this revelation, and results showed that the greasy fingertips at the scene were a match for William Mitchell. And the greasy substance, thought to be sorbeline cream, was found to be an exact match to a substance found on Karen, used in the sexual assault. With all of this evidence, the palm print, the fingertip prints, and the sorbeline cream, in late March of 1993, they had enough evidence to arrest Mitchell. And Mitchell coldly confesses to the murders, displaying little to no emotion. He then very methodically went through everything with the investigators, and for someone that, as I mentioned earlier, was affected by drugs and had also been drinking, he had a remarkably clear, sharp memory of the events, which was pretty ironic, as he would later blame his drug taking for what he did to Karen and her children. Anyway, Mitchell led investigators to their last key pieces of evidence: a tomahawk axe and a bottle of sorbeline hand lotion. He told investigators that after killing Karen and her family, he drove to the nearby muddy Greenough River and threw the axe in there, and then threw the sorbeline cream in the rubbish. After this confession, divers immediately were sent to retrieve the axe, and after spending 5 weeks in muddy waters, remarkably the axe still had some of the victim's hairs stuck to it. But as far as I could tell, they never did retrieve the sorbeline hand lotion. But I guess with his confession, maybe they just didn't really need it. And of course, this left the question that everybody wanted to know. Why? Why did he commit such awful crimes? Karen and Mitchell, as I said, were acquaintances. They knew each other, but they didn't have any real connections. They hadn't really spent much time together. They hadn't formed any kind of relationship, and they just didn't have much of anything to do with each other. So Mitchell's response to this question, and I am paraphrasing here, was that he drove over to Karen's house in the early hours of Monday morning with every intention of killing not only Karen, but all of her children. But somehow, for the life of him, he could not remember why he made these plans, even though he literally remembered every other detail from that night. And to this day, he has never given a reason as to why he did what he did, why he took away the lives of a mother of 3 and her very innocent children. Although it is speculated it's because Karen knocked back his sexual advances, which would have to be the most ridiculous reason that I have ever heard for slaughtering an entire family. But okay, now let's go through exactly what happened on the day of the murders. On Sunday, February 21, William Mitchell spent the day heavily drinking, using cannabis and injecting amphetamines. And he was doing this at the same house in Geraldton that the party had been held at. He left the house at around 2:30 a.m. and headed to Karen's house, arriving around 3 a.m. As Mitchell pulled into the driveway, he was greeted by the barking of the family dog, and Daniel, who was still awake, heard this barking, so he went outside to investigate. When Daniel walked outside, a car was pulling into the driveway. The car parked, and out got Mitchell with his tomahawk axe in hand. At this point, we can only guess that Daniel either recognized Mitchell as he had been around the house and didn't immediately feel threatened, or he was temporarily blinded by the headlights. Either way, my guess is that he would have still been pretty confused to see someone visiting at that time of the morning, and whether he saw the axe or not, we will never know. And this is where I'm going to insert a timestamp so you can skip ahead to where we talk about the sentencing. Whatever Daniel may have been thinking, he wasn't given enough time to react, as Mitchell pretty much attacked him as soon as he got out the car, hacking at him until he fell to the ground, where he continued the attack. After Daniel was dead, Mitchell entered the home, where he found Karen fast asleep on a mattress on the living room floor. He leaned over Karen, and as he had with Daniel, began hacking. Her body started spasming, and Mitchell continued to attack her head and neck until she stopped moving. He then went into Karen's room to look for any drugs, and while he was there, he grabbed a bottle of sorbeline cream. He then went back to Karen's body, placed her in a crouching, kneeling type position, and used the hand lotion to rape and sodomize her. He then covered Karen's top half with a blanket and left her in the crouching position. After this, he entered the rooms of 7-year-old Amara, followed by 5-year-old Katrina. The details of the girls' deaths were deemed so gruesome, so graphic, that the judge on the case ordered a rare suppression order, meaning that the details of these crimes were sealed away and never to be released to the public. When Mitchell was finished, he proceeded to the bathroom and attempted to clean himself up before taking the axe and the hand lotion with him and driving off, disposing of the axe and the hand lotion on his way. In 1995, the now 24-year-old William Mitchell pled guilty to 4 counts of willful murder, 3 counts of interfering with a dead body, 4 counts of sexual assault, and unrelated, several counts of armed robbery. However, Mitchell would blame his drug and alcohol consumption for the murders, claiming that he was not of sound mind. Yet he was somehow of sound enough mind to drive to an isolated property, kill 4 people, 3 being children, attempt to clean up and dispose of the murder weapon and evidence. Oh, and of course recount every detail of the crime. He was eventually sentenced to 4 life sentences, meaning 4 times 20 years, but here's the catch. They were ordered to be served concurrently, meaning he was basically sentenced to a minimum of 20 years, after which he could apply for parole, which is insane. For context, at least here in WA, pretty much no one gets a life in jail, with one exception that I'll mention in a moment, no matter how bad the crime is, because our justice system believes everyone deserves a chance to be rehabilitated, which, look, yes, depending on the crime, but there should be a line, you know? If someone kills an entire family with an axe, they'd lose their right to earn freedom. It's as simple as that. And on top of his short jail term, Mitchell was given strict security in prison, meaning that he was protected from other prisoners that probably would have wanted to beat the shit out of a child killer. So the exception to life meaning life that I mentioned a moment ago actually happened very recently. I'll quickly go over it. So in 2018, right here in Perth, Anthony Robert Harvey killed 5 members of his family, including 3 young children. And that is just the beginning of how sick this case is. I've actually had this case requested quite a lot, but I honestly don't think that I can talk about it. It happened in the suburb of Bedford, in a house on a street that I am far too familiar with. I actually don't think too many people are familiar with this case outside of WA, but for right now, this case really is just too recent to discuss. Anyway, last year, Anthony Robert Harvey was sentenced to life in prison with an order that he was to never be released. And he was sentenced by none other than the wonderful Justice Stephen Hall from the Claremont serial killer trial. And this was the first sentence in WA's history to receive a non-release order. Although back in the day we did have the death penalty, so I guess that kind of was our life sentence back then, but I digress. The Crown did actually appeal to have Mitchell's sentence changed to no chance of parole, never to be released, and they won, much to the relief of Karen's friends and family, and the public, of course, who had been calling for the return of the death penalty. However, Mitchell appealed this change and won back his original sentence of 20 years minimum. I honestly do not have any words at this point. At the 20-year mark in 2013 and again in 2016, Mitchell did apply for parole, but was denied, thankfully. And I really don't know what the standard is, but here in WA, you can apply for parole every 3 years, meaning that Karen's friends and family are not only put through hell every few years, not to mention the preparation and anticipation, but there is always a small thought in the back of their minds that there is a possibility that Mitchell will one day walk free, which must be terrifying. Some progress was made towards the end of 2018, however, when new laws were introduced to WA that delayed parole consideration for select mass murderers, serial killers, etc. And under this new law, 6 prisoners, including Mitchell, had their parole applications pushed back for a further 6 years, meaning Mitchell cannot apply for parole until 2025. And while it's not the perfect solution, it's a start. So you may be wondering at this point, how the heck did William Mitchell get off with such a light sentence? Well, apparently it came down to the fact that he was under the influence of drugs and also that he showed genuine remorse in court. Give me a break, really. And also because he apparently doesn't fall under the worst category of killers or criminals. And as he's shown that he's a drug addict, it means that there is a chance he could be rehabilitated. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts down below on all of this, because if I sat here and told you everything that was on my mind right now, we would be here all day. But if you found this video valuable and want to hear more Australian or WA true crime, check out these videos somewhere on the screen, or my Claremont serial killer series that I did just complete. I think it's pretty good if I do say so myself. Thank you to my channel members, my absolute stars, and thank you for listening to Karen, Daniel, Amara, and Katrina's story. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay safe, and I will see you very soon. Bye guys.